Hello and welcome to this webinar on SAP Business One production module. My name is Ketan Solanki, and for the next hour or so, we're going to be running through the following agenda. So we're going to look at a bit of the introduction and setup, look at how you can plan and monitor resourcing in SAP Business One, look at the routing functionality and capability, how to set up and manage bill of materials, look at how the production cost roll-up works, run a few production orders, and run through the process of issuing and receiving those. So let's talk a bit about what the production module in SAP is all about. So it allows you to manage bills of materials. You can specify quantities of components that make up a product. You can manage resources and capacity of your production line. Monitor standard production costing, and analyze your production variances. You can then create production orders as a set of instructions for planning and assembling your item. It tracks all the material transactions and the costs involved in the production process, as well as any additional costs such as labor and overheads. You can also manage routings, which is a way of grouping the whole production process into its various segments. And we'll all be looking at all of those as we go through this session. So to start with, let's look at some of the setup related to this that we have to do to get it all working. So firstly, under administration, setup, so administration, system initialization, general settings. Under the resources tab, you've got a few settings that you need to consider. The first one is what is the default warehouse for your resources. So similarly to how you have a default warehouse for your items, you also can define default warehouse for your resources. And what happens is there is a hierarchy around how the warehouse gets selected when you pick a resource for a bill of material. So initially, it'll look at if there is a default warehouse against the actual resource itself. Then it'll look at if there is a default warehouse for resources against the user setup. And then finally, it will look at this particular setting. The next one here is the auto add all warehouses to new resources. So this is when you create a new resource, will all the warehouses be linked to it? If you have this box ticked, then it will be. Otherwise, you have to then go in and add those resources manually. The final setting here is all about when you look at the capacity of the resource, what is the default period that will be shown. In this case, what we see here is going to look a month out into the future from today. So that's the first setting. The other setting that we have is again under administration, system initialization, general settings. And under the items or the stock tab, this is a new setting for version 10. What you can now do is when you drill from an item which has a BOM related to it, instead of opening the bill of materials screen, it'll go into the item master. So you either have this switched on, so it goes to the item master, and if you have it switched off, then it'll first go into the BOM, as was the case in prior versions. Let's have a look at the concept of resource groups. So that's under setup, administration, setup, and resources, and the resource group. So this is basically allowing you to set up a hierarchy, two-level hierarchy on your resources. So you have a resource group, and all the different resources that you have are linked to that. And the idea behind this is to group, machines and resources that have similar attributes and cost attributes together. The other setting is the resource properties, and this is similar to item and business partner properties, allowing you to, again, categorize these, and then you can use this for filters and reports and such. The next thing you need to do when it comes to setting up production is you got to define your GL accounts. Under setup and financials and GL account determination, you need to define two parts. One is under the stock tab, you got to define your work in progress account and the work in progress variance account. So the work in work in progress stock account is the stock that gets debited when you issue materials into the production, and it also gets credited when you receive the final products, so clearing the WIP account. And then the work in progress variance account is once you've completed the production and you close the production order, if there are any variances, particularly if you're using standard costs, then those variances get posted into that account. So that's the first setting. The other setting you need to do is under resources. So in here, you can have multiple cost elements that you can use to break down the resource or the overhead that you're using. And so my example here, I've got two different clearing accounts or recovery accounts, one for production recovery and another for overhead recovery. And as I said, you've got up to 10 of those. And then you can also have a different work in progress account for resources from your normal work in progress account. It could be the same as your stock work in progress. Now, you can also do advanced GL determination in all of this. So that's that's just a pretty standard SAP functionality. If you wanted to have a different recovery account for a different warehouse or a different item group and all those types of things, you do that through the advanced GL determination. I will not be going through this. I mean, there was another webinar earlier in the finance section where we've covered advanced GL determination. Okay, so now let's have a look at the resource master. Under resources and resource master, and I'm just going to bring up a resource here, which is a labor type resource, and let's just go through the different settings here. So we've got a code, a description, a type, so that can be either a labor or a machine, or a type other. And then you can assign it to a group. We've seen those groups earlier. Then you have a unit of measure text. So what is one resource unit equal to? What is that unit of measure? In this case, I'm saying it's an hour. And we're saying that the time per resource unit is also 1 hour, and the resources units per time period is 1. So we can make 1 in 1 hour. And that's the setup, particularly in this particular resource. And the other thing is you can also define the cost of these resources. So in this case, I've got those two cost elements. We looked at the GL account determination, and we had different GL accounts for different cost elements. The total of my resource is $200. Essentially, I'm saying that my resource costs $200 an hour. Then you have the issue method. So this is, when I use this resource in a production order, will this be backflashed, or do I need to manually issue it and tell how much resource time that was actually used? Resource allocation. So this is how the resource will be allocated when the production order is created. And you can also create a linked item for this resource. Now that would particularly make sense where you, let's say, doing some sort of outsourcing and getting someone else to do some work on the production for you. So you can then raise the production order, the purchase order against this item so that you can track all information relating to the resource against the item. I'm just going to open up another resource now, so that it's going to a different resource. Now, if you'll see this resource, the resource unit of measure is each. So in this case, I'm saying one resource unit is basically the time it takes me to make one. And then my time per resource unit is still 1 hour, but now I can make 12 units in an hour. So in other words, this is 60 minutes divided by 12. So my resource unit is actually 5 minutes, 60 divided by 12. So I could have set this particular time per resource unit to 5, and I could have set this to 1, and that would have had the same impact. Now you can also see that the costing in here is different. In this case, I'm saying it's $12.50 per resource unit because it's basically 5-minute resource. It's a time. The resource is worth 5 minutes of time. So just slightly different way of seeing the same thing. Let's go back and I'm going back to my original resource that I was looking at. Let's now look at the capacity data. So this just shows me what is the total capacity of this resource and how much of that has been committed. So committed means there's actual production orders in the system that is consuming the resource capacity that I've got, and then I've got the available capacity. We'll show you how to set up the capacity a bit later on in this session, but just be aware that this is how you set up the capacity, and then this is how you can view that information. So if I now look at the planning data, this is where I can see what my daily capacity is and what it's made up of. So this is my theoretical capacity. This is not what we're seeing in the capacity data. The capacity data needs to be populated through another process, but this is my planned capacity. Now, you can have up to 4 elements within your capacity planning. In my case, I'm saying I've got 9-hour shifts with 2 employees giving me 18-hour capacity. Okay, and then there's this concept of relevant to single capacity run. So how this works is that if you are raising a production order and you're processing it through, it may be that you can only have 1 employee working on a production order at a time. So then in single capacity run in this case would then be just 9 hours. You cannot have 18 hours of capacity on that production order because you can only have 1 person or 1 machine attending to that particular production order. So then in that case, you'd set this one to no, and then the single run capacity is 9 hours. Yeah, I'll set that back. The next setting here is employees. So you can link a resource to employees, and in this case, I did say that I have 5 employees, so I could have linked 5 different employees to this resource. Now, if my resource is a machine, there it is, I've got a machine here, then in that case, I'll be able to link it to a fixed assets if I do have the fixed assets register enabled in my database. And again, both these is only for information purposes. It doesn't affect anything. It's not going to impact any postings. It's not going to run any depreciation based on utilization or any of that. The properties we've already seen before, so you can categorize things, and then you've got attachments and remarks. So this is our resource master data. Now, how do you actually define the resource capacity based on the plan? So you can right-click on your resource master data, and then you can go in and select this option called the internal resource capacity. And then you can see here that I've got 18 hours of capacity per day. That's what I've defined. Now I can adjust this. So if on a particular day the machine's going to be down, not running, I'm running 1 shift, I could manually change the resource capacity for that particular day. Only if need be. The other thing we can also do is show the resource capacity as a cumulative from today. So it's showing as an increasing balance, just adding up the next day and the next day and so on. So if I go back to cumulative quantity, untick that. Now, right now I'm showing as per the default that we saw earlier, we're only showing for the next 30 days. If I just increase this and refresh, now I'll see it further down, and you can see that I have not added capacity into the future. I've only done it for the next 30 days. Now, if I wanted to add that capacity, I can do that from here. I'll refresh this, and I'll say set internal daily capacities for that particular resource and update. And now if I go across, I can see that it's assigned all the capacity all the way to the end of the given period that I had selected. Okay, so now let's have a look at some of the other details we can see. Just going to change my filter slightly and select some additional resources in here, and then refresh it. So now it's showing me all the resources in that particular warehouse. What I can now do is look at a few other things. We've been looking at the internal capacity. Let's see what happens when I say let's look at the committed capacity. So the committed capacity is what production orders are live in the system, and from here I can then even click on a particular capacity and see what it's made up of. So there's 18 hours of capacity assigned on this particular day. If I click on that, what will happen is it will go in and show me what production order is contributing to that number. I can look at another one. I can see it's showing me 2 production orders. Now, note, you'll observe that my resource actually only has a capacity of 18 hours, but I've got 32 hours of work loaded onto that resource. Let me just show you again. So we were looking at that particular resource there. If I change back to internal, I've only got 18 hours of capacity, but if I look at the commitment, it's showing 32. This is because SAP Business One isn't considering what other production orders may already be allocated to that particular resource on a given day. All it's doing is saying, I've got a production order, I know what the normal capacity of this resource is, and I'm just going to allocate it anyway without considering what else may be there. However, the nice thing is, if you go and look at the available capacity, you can see on certain days it's negative because the internal capacity minus the commitment is negative. So you can see there's a problem on some days. The other thing you can also do is if you show the cumulative capacity, you start to see where you may not have sufficient capacity for a resource, and at what point does it get back to normal. So if you see, again, the same resource that we were looking at, it's sitting at negative for a long period of time, and then starting from 8th of June, we're back into positive. So what that tells us is that we've got production orders against this resource that is consuming it at least till the 8th of June. So it's sort of rough cut type capacity planning. It's not allocating specific jobs to specific time slots per se. All right, so that come out of this resource capacity area, and let's now look at some of the other bits of information. So firstly, just back to this resource allocation section. We've got 4 options here. Now, we've got the resources allocation on the start date, on the end date, start date forward, end date backwards. So if you just set it to start date, what will happen is all the capacity, all the requirements for this resource will just get allocated to the start date of the production order. Likewise, on the end date means it'll just get allocated to the end date. Start date forward means the production order, that particular production order will look at the internal capacity of that resource and just start allocating it until day by day until it's got enough allocation. So, for example, if you had a production order that needed 100 hours of a particular resource and a daily capacity was only 20, then you'll see 5 days of allocation to get to the 100 hours. And if you set it up to be end date backwards, then it works just the reverse way. Okay, so that covers the resource master. The next thing we're going to look at is the setup around routings. So routing is basically a way of categorizing your production process into its various steps. And so if I go into production and route stages, I've defined a number of different routings. And these can be, it's up to you how many you want to define. And then we'll see later on when we set up the bills of materials how these are allocated. Okay, so that covers resources and routings. So the next thing we're going to look at is bills of materials. So that's found under production and bills of materials. Now, SAP Business One allows 4 different types of bills of materials: assembly, sales, production, and template. Now, this webinar is more around production, so main focus is around production bills of materials and how they work, but I'll quickly run through what the other options are just for your information. So assembly and sales bill of materials are pretty much the same, except just there's a slight subtle difference between the two. So what they do is they're basically sales kits. Right? They allow you to manage sales kits. So they represent a finished product that is assembled at the sales stage, and the finished product is composed of its component items only when the parent product is actually sold. The component items are stored and tracked individually in the warehouse. The parent item is never stocked in the system. Okay, so the parent item is a non-stock item, and you will never be able to tell how many of those you have. When you look at the item master data. So let us just quickly have a look at an example of an assembly BOM. So there it is. That's my assembly BOM. So it's basically a twin pack, and when we do the production, when we do the picking of this particular assembly, you're essentially picking the 2 components that it's made up of. And likewise, same on the sales kit as well. It's the same setup. The only difference is when you raise a sales order for these types of items, there's a slight difference. So firstly, I'm going to pick the assembly one, and the assembly one just pulls up that item and that item only. It doesn't show the components. Whereas if I pick the sales BOM, then what it does is it also loads the components that it's made up of. Now, from here you can manipulate, change quantities for the components. You can also change the warehouse, whereas on the assembly BOM you don't have that capability. Whatever is the warehouse on the bill of material is where the stock is going to get drawn down from. Okay, so that's the 2 sales kit type bill of materials. What I'll do now is we'll look at a template BOM. So template BOM is basically a bundle of items where the parent product is the first item on the list. It does not act as a BOM once it's added to the sales document, but rather it's a list of items that have been brought together at the same time. You can then update the quantities of those items, swap the items, delete them, and there's no relationship between those items once you've loaded it into the sales transaction. So again, for example, we've got this particular one, which is a bundle, and if I then just go in and pick that item, it loads up all the other items. Once they're loaded, there's no relationship between them. You can delete some lines, you can add other lines, you can insert rows, and so on. So that's your template BOMs. It just basically allows you more flexibility in selecting components, for a bundle. That covers the other 3 types. So the final bill of material, and the one that's of most interest, is the production bill of material. We're going to look at one that I've got set up here. All right, so in this case, it's a PC with 8-core 32 GB RAM and 2 terabyte hard drive. And the process is that we're assembling this through our production process. We've got 3 stages of production. Within each one of the stages, we've got a bunch of components. plus we've got some machine or labor component, and we've got some instructions as to what the person needs to do as part of the production. Let's see here, in terms of the column called type, you can have item, resource text, and resource stage. The product itself, the bill of material is for producing 1 unit, and we're saying that the planned average size production, the general batch run is for 100. We generally make them in batches of 100. Then there's the warehouse it's related to, what price list, and project codes. So if we now look at, going across the page on the different columns that we're available, apart from the type, we have the number, which is either the route or the resource or the actual component. We have the quantities that are used for making one of these PCs, the warehouse, the additional quantity. So this additional quantity could be the setup time that needs to be spent to get the machine ready for this particular product. It could be that when you run the production, you're going to have some wastage. The machine needs to churn through 10 units of a particular material before it can start the actual production. So these are just basically extra quantities or setup time that are used. Then you've got the issue method. The issue method options are either it's a manual, which means that you have to manually tell the system how much of that component or resource was used, or it's backflushed, which means that whatever the theoretical quantity was, that's what gets issued in the background when you receive the finished product. The price list here is, it's basically drawing the price of that item from the nominated price list onto the bill of material. Then you have the production standard cost and the total production standard cost. Now, these here are based on your batch size. So you'll see that particularly for this resource here, the total production standard cost is $8.80 because we're doing a batch of 100. But if I change that batch to 1, all of a sudden the production standard cost for that component is 88 because we have some setup time. And you also notice that the total production standard cost changes based on the batch size as well. So when I changed to 1, this became close to $1,200. If I go back to 100, this goes to about 1,100. Now this is the sort of calculated production standard cost based on the standard costs that are defined on individual items. We're going to have a look at how this is used a bit later on. Then you can put some comments. You can define a different work in progress account if need be. You can have your route sequences and waiting days. So this is where if once you finish a particular route stage, if there is a waiting time because the product needs to be cured or it needs to go through some sort of a wait process, then you can say I've got to wait X number of days before the next stage starts. All right. The other thing you can do here is if you are wanting to figure out a base cost of the item, you can then click on this triangle at the bottom, and what it'll do is it'll take the total cost of the item and populate that, and then if I click the update button, then it'll update the actual base price on the item master data for this item. Okay, so that basically covers your bill of material. Just one other thing I wanted to mention. If I went into the item master itself for any one of these items, and if you go to the production data tab, there is a concept of a thing called a phantom item. So a phantom item is basically an item that exists as a non-stock item, and it doesn't really exist as a final product, but it is something that you use to make it easier for you to manage your bills and materials. So a good example of that would be, let's say you're a bakery and you're doing some cake mixtures, and your basic cake mixture may be flour, sugar, and baking powder. Now you don't actually have that mixed per se, but you would set up a phantom bill of material for your basic cake mix so that when you set up all the different products that you bake, you don't have to add all those components each time, and then you can clearly see how much of your basic cake mix you need to make those items. So that's just an example of where you might use a phantom bill of material. Okay, now we're going to look at the BOM component management functionality. The way that works is you can go into production and production's bill of materials component management, and from here you've got a number of different options. You can use this functionality to bulk update components within a bill of materials. So this is change BOM line. So this might be the case when a particular raw material has been superseded and you're replacing all your bills of materials where this component exists by a new component. So you can just say change bill of material lines, and then you got all these various options on what is the replacement component, whether it's the same quantity or not. Are you going to change any of the issue methods? Is it going to a different routing stage, and so on. Then you got options to delete BOM lines. So you may just want to totally remove a particular component because it's no longer required. You may also change the header. You can also add lines. So this allows you to do bulk management of your bills and materials. Do note that there is no option to roll back once you've applied the change. So do this very carefully, because perhaps in a test system before you go in and do it in the live. All right. So as for the BOM component management, what we'll do now is look at the standard cost management. So we sort of had a look at that in terms of your batch sizes. The other thing to look at is where is this actual standard cost coming from, right? So if I drill into this item, on the production data tab, there is a value here. There's a number here. It's called the production standard cost. It says $340. And the other thing is we've got it set to include it in the production standard cost rollup, which means that when we do the rollup, this item is included. If it didn't tick the box, it would be excluded. So 340 is what the production standard cost is saying. If I go into the inventory data, I'll notice that this item actually, the real cost or the item cost, in this case, moving average cost, is $325. So there is a slight difference between the two. Now, you can import this data. You can manually update it. But there is a third way of updating it, which is you can go in and say, I want to do a production standard cost update. So what does it say here? It says update production standard cost from current valuation costs. So in our case, the example we had, that item had a moving average cost. So if I just executed this across all the items, what it'll do is pick up the current valuation cost, whether it is a standard cost, whether it's moving average, whatever the costing method may be, it'll just pick that up and it'll update the production standard cost with that number. So I'm going to run this now, and it's already executed. Now, if I come back to that bill of material and just refresh the screen, you'll see that the production standard cost has been updated. Now it's showing $325, and the total rolled up cost is $1144.59. However, if you look at the production standard cost at the header level, it's saying $1049. There's a difference. And you can see on this item, there it is, $1049. So That's just coming straight from the item master data. Now there's a second function here called the production standard cost roller. And what that does is it takes all the different levels of bills and materials that you may have, and it'll sum it all up and roll it all up, and then update the top level bill of material with the rolled up costs. So if I run this now across all my items, and that's just completed, and if I now refresh this, you can see that the bill of material per item cost and the total sum of all the components is now matching. Right? Now, there is no financial impact of what I just did. All it is purely informational purposes. It's just rolling up the costs that have been defined in the system. However, if I was running a standard cost system, and if I wanted to then update my standard cost, you could use this information possibly with a bit of BOM or some formatted searches and logic to do a material revaluation to then apply those calculated costs into your products. Okay, that covers the production standard costs. One other thing I've failed to mention earlier around the bills and materials is that if you had a production or a bill of material where you had a finished product, but you also had some resulting byproducts in the production run, what you can do is you can add that item into the bill of material with a negative quantity. And so basically what then happens is any items with negative quantity are receipted as part of the production process, and you end up with those things coming back into stock. So that's how you can handle byproducts as well as other sort of complementary products part of the production run. All right, so now we're going to go and look at the production order and how that all sort of brings all of this information together. Production order is essentially an instruction to your factory to make something, right? So if I go in and select the item that we've been looking at, and there it is, and let's say I'm going to make 10 of these. Right, so as soon as I say 10 of these, the planned quantity on the line levels gets updated accordingly. You can have 3 different types of production orders. It can be a standard, which is the one I've just done, where you need a bill of material. You can do a special production order, which is where you don't actually have a bill of material, but you're doing some sort of a one-off type production, and you need to, you need to do some sort of material conversion. Then you use a special. And the third one is a disassembly, which is, you're sort of breaking a product apart into its components. Then you've got the status of the production order. So when you first create a production order, it's going to be planned. So I've added this one here. But for you to do any transactions and, record the production and issue the components, you have to release the production order. So you're going to change the status to released. Once you've released it, you can then do all the work on it. And then finally, you can close the production order once it's finished. The other thing you'll notice is that this is new in version 10. You can now change the description of the components as well as of the parent item before adding the production order. Likewise, on the actual bill of material as well, you can go in and change the description of one of the components. Now, this description will only affect this particular production order, this particular bill of material alone. It will not update the actual item master record. So, it's just maybe something that's more informational for the bill of material, but, you don't want to change the item, then you have that capability to do it since version 10. Okay, so back to our production order. We've we've created it. We're saying that we're going to make 10. And so now we can see if some extra information about, how long it's going to take to make this. So, to make one of these, we need 0.05 of an hour. So to make 10, we need 0.5 of an hour, which is basically saying we need half an hour of time. And then the next one here, again, we need 2 hours of time, which equates to that planning again. So if we look at how we can then use that from our planning perspective, it then also, if I click on this route date calculation and I say I'm going to do start date forward, and then I say update now, and then it's going to do all the resource allocation. And then we've got start date and an end date on the production. Now, obviously my production is finishing within a day, but if I went and built a greater quantity of product, and then I did the update again, you see now it's telling me that the first phase of the production is starting on the 27th, finishing on the 2nd. Stage 2 starts on the 2nd, finishes on the 4th, and stage 3 starts on the 4th, finishes on the 5th. So it's calculating all the timings based on the resources we've got, and it's telling us how long it's going to take to complete the whole production order. So I'm just going to change this back to 10 units. Now let's have a look at how we process some of this information. The other thing you'll note is the resource here, which had a setup time. So if I change this back to 1, you can see I'll need 0.1 as a base quantity and then 1.1 because of my setup time. If I change this to 10, then I need 2 of this particular machine, 2 hours of this particular machine. Okay, so the other information just pulls through from the bill of material, whether it's backflushed or manually issued, and so on. So now what I'll do is look at how we can issue and receive the product as part of the production process. So firstly, you could just go into the receipt or issue for production. And then from here, I could pick multiple production orders to issue for, or I could pick the one that we've been looking at. And then from there, I can pick the components that I want to issue, right? And then I can click add. And basically, this will then issue those materials to the production order. Likewise, I can do the same on the receipt from production. I can go into receipt from production, I can say production order, and then I can pick one or many production orders, choose them, and then I can say how many of those I've completed if I haven't completed the full quantity. And then the other thing here is that you've got whether you've completed or whether you're rejecting. Now, the completion or rejecting is purely information. If you are rejecting something, then the recommended process in SAP Business One would be that you just reject it and put it into a reject warehouse so that it doesn't get recognized as part of your good stock. Okay, so now how else could you issue or receipt? So you could just simply go right-click, and then you could do an issue component. And then you got some more options here. You can then say, well, I want to issue all my products just relating to a particular route sequence. I can do some other filters. I can also say, well, I want to issue materials. I'm making 10 of the final product, but I want to issue materials relating to 5. So there's some capabilities here, and then you go, okay, then it just populates that information as well. You could also go in, right-click, and do a report completion, which will be the receipt from production. But the other interesting ones are transfer requests. So If your raw materials are sitting in a different warehouse to where you do the production, you could even raise a transfer request. And again, it's the same thing. What quantities are you trying to pull? What route status and so on. And then it basically opens up a transfer request where you can put that in, and then this stock could be transferred from a particular bin, or from a particular warehouse to another warehouse. Other option here is you can also do a component transfer. So instead of doing a request, we'll just create a transfer. You can generate a pick slip. So if I go and do that and click OK there, then basically now it's generated a pick list, which is basically then you can give that to someone to go and say, well, here, go pick all these components relating to this production order. They go and do their thing. They come back, mark this as picked, and then any of the items that are manual issue, you can still then create an issue for production from here. So any one of those options is available for doing this. The other thing to note is, so let me just complete that. Let me just do that while I'm here. So this one here, I'm going to go create and issue for production. And I'm issuing the two quantities or the two items or resources that were marked as manual issue. If I refresh the screen now, it will show me the lines that have been issued. The issue quantity has been updated for those two lines. I can go into the summary and I can see the actual components that have gone in, the total resources, and at this stage there's a variance. We also see here is the total production time. So it's saying it's based on the theoretical. It's 1 hour 21 minutes to do this, and if there's any total days, this converts into the days as well. Now I'll go in and report the completion as well. So if I right click and report completion, and I say I've made the 10 that I was planning to make, and add those in, what will happen is in the background, all the items that have been marked for manual issue will get, all the items that have been marked for backflush will get automatically issued as well. So you can see everything is now issued. If I go into the summary, there's no variance, there's all the costing information. You can actually drill in and look at all the transactions that have been created in the system for this. But also the nice thing is you can right click and say, show me the relationship map. And you see all this information. So this issue for production is the one that we did as a manual. This issue for production is the one that happened as a result of the backflushing. So you can see it's got a dotted line with the receipt from production. I can go and look at it and you can say it was automatically created. Okay, and then the final step is once you've finished doing what you needed to do, you've issued everything, then you can close the production order. If there are any variances at that point, those variances get posted automatically. If I now just have a look at the issue once more and look at the journal entry, you'll remember that when I had set up some of these resources, I had multiple recovery accounts for those journals, for those resources. And so it's posted and split my journal entry for the issue into those different recovery accounts as well. Another word of caution, currently SAP still doesn't have a way of returning incorrectly manufactured items. So what I mean by that is you plan to make 10, let's say you only ended up making 9, but you still received the full 10, well, you can't go back into the production order and say, well, I want to, return 1 because I didn't actually make the full quantity. The only way to do that is via disassembly, and a disassembly order doesn't really consider all the routings and resources and such. It will not return those things. So I'm just going to quickly create a disassembly order just to show what that looks like. So it's going to say type disassembly, and I'm going to pick my item, and you see it automatically loaded up just the items and the text. It did not load the resources, and it did not load any of the route stages. And add that, I go in, release it. If I then right click on that and say report completion, what it will do, it'll issue the finished product into the production line. And when I right click and say receipt components, it's going to it'll only receipt the ones that are marked as manual. Everything else will get received as part of the backflushing when you issue the raw material. So that's the disassembly process, basically, pulling apart the PC and getting all those components in place. Now, the final one is the special. Now, there is some new functionality around the special production order in version 10, and that's to do with how you could now rework a finished product and have the finished product as a component of the parent item. So what I mean by that is, let's say I made a PC and there was a faulty item within that PC, and I need to repair it. So what I can do now is I can put the same PC as a raw material, and then I can say, well, my motherboard was blown, so I'm going to replace the motherboard. So now you can actually do this. You can have the finished product and the raw material being the same on only a special type production order. So I'll add that, and then I can basically go through the same steps to complete this. So that's a pretty reasonable update that SAP have provided with version 10, particularly if you do want to do some rework on items that you've already produced. The other thing you'll notice is that there is now attachments available on a production order as well. Let's look at just a couple of reports that are available in the system as standard. So if you look at production reports and the open items list. So this here, you can sort of have no filter and see all the open production orders, but you can also then go in and say, show me all the planned ones, and then from there, batch release production orders. Right, you can just cancel them in batch. Likewise, you can also go into released ones and bulk change the status to close. So if you've already completed production, then you can just go in and close a whole heap of them at once. The other thing is the bill of material report. This gives you a view of the bills of materials in a hierarchical fashion. So if I expanded this, then you can see, the whole bill of material, what route stages they're related to, and if multiple bills of material, multi-level bill of material, you'll also see that information. The last thing I want to just cover is have a look at how you could do make-to-order production. So, if you've got a sales order, it comes through and it's for the same item we were looking at before. Let's say someone wanted 5 of this, and there was a special order, there's something specific needed to be done, or we don't really hold them in stock. I could go in as part of the creation of the sales order. I can tick procure non-drop ship items and add. Oops, I've got some mandatory fields here. Add. And what happens is once I add this, we get the procurement confirmation visit, and we can then generate a production order from that, and it has a link to the sales order. And in fact, if you looked at the sales order as well, there'll be a link to the production order. So that hereby concludes what I was planning to cover in this session. If you do have any further questions about the session today, please get in touch with, you can either get in touch with the account manager, or you can get in touch with your consultant as well.